The gray skies hung low over the small college town in Texas, the rain painting the streets slick and reflective. Brian Tracy trudged along the drenched sidewalks, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and his face a canvas of exhaustion and worry. At 23, Brian was balancing the relentless demands of his final year in law school with a part-time job and the crushing weight of debts left behind by his late father. Life had become a tightrope, and he was perilously close to losing balance. A sudden vibration in his pocket interrupted his thoughts. Fishing out his phone, he answered. Brian Tracy speaking. A composed, authoritative voice responded. Mr. Tracy, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you regarding your financial situation. Brian frowned, confused. I'm sorry, who are you? How do you know about... I know enough, she interjected smoothly. Meet me at Brooks' Bistro at 7 p.m. It's important. The line went dead before Brian could reply. Confusion warred with curiosity as he pocketed his phone and continued his day. By evening, the rain had intensified, and Brian arrived at the upscale bistro, his jacket doing little to shield him from the downpour. Warm lighting and the rich aroma of coffee greeted him as he stepped inside, but his attention was drawn to a striking woman seated at a corner table. Eleanor Brooks, her silver hair styled impeccably, exuded an aura of wealth and control in her tailored suit. She gestured for him to sit as he approached, her tone calm yet commanding. Brian, she greeted simply. Mrs. Brooks, he replied, taking the seat opposite her. What's this about? Straight to the point. Good, she rebrined, sipping her tea. Brian, I know about your debts, the ones your father left behind. I know you're barely scraping by. I'm here to offer a solution. Brian's brow furrowed. And what would that be? She set her cup down deliberately, meeting his eyes. Marry me. The words landed like a thunderclap. Brian blinked. Sure he had misheard. Excuse me? You heard me, she said, her voice unwavering. This isn't about romance. It's a business arrangement. I'll pay off all your debts, secure your financial future, and in return, you'll be my husband. A disbelieving laugh escaped him. You're serious? Why me? You don't even know me. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his. Exactly. You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this. I don't need love, Brian. I need a companion. Someone to share my name, my estate, and nothing more. Think of it as a contract. Brian shook his head, the absurdity of the proposition swirling in his mind. This is insane. What's in it for you? For the first time, her expression softened. I've spent my life alone, Brian. No children, no family left. I want companionship, even if it's only for appearances. And I want control over my legacy. A husband will help solidify that. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I can't. I need time to think. Of course, she replied coolly. But don't take too long. The offer won't stand forever. That night, Brian walked home through the rain, its chill seeping into his bones. Sitting at the kitchen table, he explained Eleanor's proposition to his mother. Her face, pale and etched with worry, reflected the gravity of their circumstances. Her treatments had drained them financially, and his younger sister's looming tuition only compounded the strain. Brian, she said softly, I know it sounds unthinkable, but if she's willing to help, maybe it's worth considering. Brian stared at his hands, his pride warring with his desperation. You're asking me to marry a woman I don't love just to solve our problems. I'm asking you to save yourself, she replied, her voice trembling. To save us. The following morning, Brian returned to the bistro. Eleanor was already there, her calm composure unshaken as she glanced at her tablet. You've decided, she said, without looking up. Brian took a deep breath, the weight of his choice pressing down on him. Yes, he said, his voice steady. Brian lay in the king-size bed, staring at the ornate ceiling, his mind churning with questions and unease. The key in his pocket felt heavier than its size should allow, a physical manifestation of the mystery enveloping Eleanor's estate. The air in the room was still, too still, as though even the house itself held its breath, waiting for something to unfold. The whispers of the staff, the cryptic rebrinds from Eleanor, and the locked doors that seemed to mock his presence all gnawed at him. What secrets was this house hiding? Why had Eleanor chosen him, of all people, for this bizarre arrangement? Unable to sleep, Brian sat up and stared out the massive windows overlooking the moonlit garden. The meticulously trimmed hedges and elegant fountains seemed serene at first glance, but under the cover of darkness, they appeared almost menacing. He thought about his family, his mother's hopeful eyes and his sister's future riding on his decision. Had he truly saved them, or had he traded their troubles for a new set of his own? The key in his pocket felt like a burning question. What was behind those locked doors? His curiosity warred with caution, but as the hours ticked by, curiosity won. Slipping out of bed, he padded quietly to the door, careful not to make a sound. The hallway was bathed in a dim, ghostly light from sconces lining the walls. The shadows they cast danced unnervingly as Brian moved silently toward the nearest locked door he had passed earlier. The brass handle felt cold under his touch as he slid the key into the lock. For a moment he hesitated. Was he ready to uncover whatever Eleanor was hiding? Steeling himself, he turned the key. The lock clicked with an unsettling finality, and the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room. Inside, rows of shelves lined the walls, filled not with books or decorations, but with boxes and stacks of papers. A large desk sat in the center, cluttered with photographs, ledgers, and what appeared to be legal documents. Brian stepped inside, the musty scent of aged paper filling his nose. On the desk was a single-framed photograph of a man who looked vaguely familiar. It wasn't until he leaned closer that he realized why. It was his father. Brian's breath caught in his throat. What was his father's picture doing here? He picked up the frame, his hands trembling. Beneath the photo, a date was scrawled in elegant handwriting. July 14th, 1999. That was the year his father's business collapsed, sending their family into financial ruin. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of his father's cryptic stories about business rivals and betrayals. Eleanor's words from dinner echoed in his mind. Not all encounters end well. He set the photograph down and rifled through the papers on the desk. One document caught his attention, a contract bearing his father's signature and Eleanor's name. It was a business deal, one that seemed to end poorly for his father. Brian's stomach churned as he read on, his father's financial downfall and eventual death taking on new, sinister undertones. The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped him out of his thoughts. Brian quickly stuffed the photograph and a few papers into his pocket, shutting the drawer softly. He turned to leave but froze as the door creaked open wider. Standing there was Eleanor, her piercing blue eyes glinting in the dim light. "You've been busy," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. Brian stammered, I couldn't sleep. Curiosity can be a dangerous thing, Brian," she interrupted, stepping into the room. Her gaze fell to the desk and then back to him. "Especially in this house? What is all this?" he demanded, his voice shaking but firm. "Why is my father's name on these papers? What did you do to him?" Eleanor tilted her head, a faint smirk curling her lips. "Your father and I had unfinished business, as I mentioned. But don't concern yourself with matters that are beyond your understanding. You have your own role to play here." "I didn't agree to this," Brian said, his fist clenching. "You agreed to marry me," Eleanor replied smoothly, "and that binds you to more than you realize. Now, go back to your room. You'll learn what you need to know in time." Brian wanted to argue, but the steel in her voice left no room for defiance. He brushed past her and returned to his room, the weight in his pocket heavier than ever. As he lay in bed, sleep evaded him, replaced by a growing dread. The pieces were coming together, and he didn't like the picture they painted. Whatever he had stepped into, it was far more dangerous than he had imagined. Brian's heart pounded as Eleanor's words sank in, each syllable heavy with menace. The key he still held felt cold and alien in his palm, a symbol of his naivety. He had walked into her world willingly, but now it was clear. He was nothing more than a pawn in her calculated game. "Why me?" he demanded, his voice trembling but defiant. "Why not just destroy my father's legacy outright? Why drag me into this?" Eleanor tilted her head, her piercing gaze unrelenting. "Because, Brian, destruction isn't nearly as satisfying as control. Your father took everything from me. My husband, my reputation, my future. I could have ruined him outright, yes. But where's the satisfaction in that? By marrying you, I ensure my revenge isn't just financial. It's personal. Brian shook his head, disbelief mingling with fury. I had nothing to do with what my father did. I didn't even know about your history until tonight. Eleanor stepped closer, her presence as imposing as the mansion itself. You carry his name, Brian. That's enough. And now, you carry the weight of his sins. Whether you like it or not, you're part of this. Brian's breathing quickened. The air in the room seemed thinner, the walls closing in. This is insane, he muttered. You can't just manipulate people like this. What kind of person are you? Eleanor's lips twitched into a faint, humorless smile. The kind of person your father turned me into. You do well to remember that. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence between them charged with tension. Then Eleanor's demeanor shifted, her voice softening, though her words remained razor-sharp. Brian, I didn't lie about everything. You'll leave this arrangement with your debts paid, your family secure. Isn't that what you wanted? I've given you a way out of your misery. All I ask is your compliance. Brian's fists unclenched, though his resolve didn't waver. And what if I refuse? What if I walk out that door right now? Eleanor's smile turned icy. Walk out and your debts return. Your mother's treatments will stop. Your sister's tuition? Gone. Everything I've given you will vanish in an instant. Do you think the world will care about another broke law student with a family to support? Brian swallowed hard, the weight of her words crushing him. She was right. He was trapped, and she held all the cards. But the anger burning in his chest refused to be extinguished. You think you've won, he said, his voice low. But you can't control me forever. I'll find a way out of this. Eleanor's laugh was soft but chilling. Oh, Brian, you're welcome to try. But remember, every move you make, I've already anticipated. With that, she turned and left the room, her heels clicking against the wooden floor like a metronome counting down to his inevitable defeat. Brian sank into the nearest chair, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. The diary and papers lay before him, damning evidence of Eleanor's scheme. He had stepped into her trap, but he wasn't ready to give up. As he stared at the documents, a flicker of determination sparked within him. He had survived his father's death, years of debt, and the grueling demands of law school. He wasn't about to let Eleanor Brooks dictate his life without a fight. The question now wasn't just how to escape her grasp. It was how to do it without losing everything he cared about. Brian's fingers trembled as he held the letter, the words on the page a toxic mix of rage and heartbreak. Eleanor's pain was real, her fury justified. But the twisted means by which she had entangled him made it clear she wasn't seeking justice. She wanted vengeance, no matter who paid the price. He stuffed the letter back into the envelope and slid it into his pocket. He couldn't stay in this house any longer. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the hallway, felt like a reminder of the web Eleanor had woven around him. But he also knew he couldn't simply walk away, not without ensuring his mother and sister's future was secure. The next morning, Brian confronted Eleanor during breakfast. She was seated at the head of the dining table, her poise immaculate, as though nothing in the world could rattle her. I found a letter, Brian said, his voice steady but firm. Eleanor paused mid-sip of her coffee, her eyes narrowing. Ah, so you've been snooping. And you can't keep doing this, ruining lives just to satisfy your grudge. My father's mistakes weren't mine. You can't hold me accountable for what he did. Eleanor set down her cup and leaned back in her chair, her calm demeanor unshaken. Your father didn't just make mistakes, Brian. He destroyed lives, my life. And now, you're reaping the benefits of his sins. That money you've been living off, the connections you've enjoyed, all built on lies and theft. Brian's jaw tightened. That doesn't justify this. Whatever satisfaction you're getting out of this, it's not justice. It's cruelty. Eleanor's gaze sharpened, like a blade honing in on its target. And what do you know about justice, Brian? You're just a boy playing grown-up, trying to fix things you don't even understand. You think you can waltz into my life, lecture me on morality, and walk away unscathed? Brian stood his ground, refusing to back down. Maybe I can't fix the past, but I won't let you control my future. This ends now. Eleanor rose from her seat, her towering presence as intimidating as the mansion itself. Oh, Brian, you have no idea what you're up against. This game has been in motion far longer than you've been alive. You're just a pawn, dispensable and replaceable. The air between them was electric, a standoff of wills that neither seemed ready to concede. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. If you think you can escape, go ahead. But you'll lose everything. Your mother's treatments? Gone. Your sister's tuition? Unpaid. And your precious future in law. Consider it over before it's even begun. Brian's fists clenched at his sides, his anger boiling over. You don't scare me. I'll find a way out of this. Eleanor smirked, her composure returning like armor. Good luck, Mr. Tracy. You'll need it. That night, Brian packed a small bag and left the estate, the weight of Eleanor's threats heavy on his mind. He didn't have a clear plan, only a determination to outmaneuver her. As he walked down the winding driveway, he made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth, expose her manipulations, and reclaim control of his life. For the first time in weeks, the rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and still. Brian looked back at the mansion one last time, its dark windows seeming to watch him as he disappeared into the night. The battle wasn't over, but he was no longer the frightened pawn Eleanor had expected him to be. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous. As the police escorted Eleanor out of the estate, her final words hung heavy in the air. Brian stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, relief, guilt, and an uneasy sense of foreboding. He had put an end to her schemes, but Eleanor's warning resonated deeply. Could revenge ever truly be extinguished, or did it leave scars that never fully healed? Peter placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. You did the right thing, he said gently. Brian nodded, though his heart felt far from certain. The estate seemed quieter now, as though it too had been holding its breath. The tension that had suffused the halls for weeks was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Over the following weeks, Brian worked tirelessly to sort through the aftermath. The evidence he'd handed over to the authorities had not only implicated Eleanor in illegal activities, but also revealed her connection to several other dubious business dealings. Her downfall was swift and public, and the media frenzy painted her as a woman blinded by revenge. Despite the chaos, Brian took steps to distance himself from the shadow of his father's legacy. He hired lawyers to investigate the old fraudulent dealings that had ruined the Brooks family, determined to uncover the full truth and make amends where he could. One afternoon, Brian sat in the estate's library, the same room where he had first confronted Eleanor. He held the leather-bound diary she had left behind, flipping through its pages. Each entry was a window into her pain, her bitterness, and her calculated moves. One passage stood out. Revenge feels like a purpose, but it's a hollow one. Yet, without it, what else is left? The world took everything from me. I'll take it back, no matter the cost. Brian closed the diary, a chill running down his spine. Eleanor's obsession had consumed her, leaving no room for healing. He resolved to ensure that he wouldn't follow the same path. A month later, Brian visited a small cemetery on the outskirts of town. He stood before Harold Brooks's grave, a bouquet of white lilies in his hand. The air was cool, the trees around him swaying gently in the breeze. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for what my father did to you and your family. I can't undo the past, but I'll make sure the future is different. As he placed the flowers on the grave, a sense of closure washed over him. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it was a start. Leaving the cemetery, Brian felt lighter. He had taken the first steps toward reclaiming his life, free from the chains of guilt and vengeance that had bound him for so long. The estate was sold shortly after Eleanor's arrest, and Brian used the proceeds to sell the debts his father had left behind and fund charities, focused on financial restitution and mental health support. Though the scars of the past would always remain, Brian was determined to forge a new path, one guided not by revenge, but by redemption. Brian stood up from the bench, his eyes lingering on the letter fluttering gently in the autumn breeze. His heart felt heavier, yet lighter at the same time, as he processed the words Eleanor had written to him. Those words, etched into the paper, held more than just an apology. They served as a powerful reminder that even the most fractured stories could find a way to heal, to evolve into something more meaningful. In that moment, Brian realized how much he had changed. The wounds of his past, though still present, no longer defined him. They had transformed into the very foundation of his future. He slowly walked back toward campus, the voices of the scholarship recipients still echoing in his mind. The gratitude and hope that radiated from them had instilled in him a new sense of purpose. It was as though, through helping others, he had healed parts of himself that he hadn't even realized were broken. In the midst of his struggles, Brian had learned to take the shattered fragments of his past and use them to create something that had meaning, something that would extend beyond his own life and reverberate through the lives of others. Months passed, and Brian found himself in the courtroom again, but this time not as a defendant or a mere witness, but as an advocate. His time working at the Legal Aid Center had inspired him to specialize in cases dealing with financial fraud and corporate accountability. He had seen firsthand the devastation caused by greed, both in his own family story and in the stories of countless others. It had fueled a fire inside him, driving him to ensure that no one else would have to suffer as both he and Eleanor had. Brian was determined to use his voice, his knowledge, and his experience to protect the vulnerable, to prevent the sort of harm that had torn so many lives apart, including his own. One day, while organizing case files for a particularly complex and challenging case, Brian received an unexpected phone call. It was from the warden of the prison, where Eleanor was serving her reduced sentence. Brian's breath caught in his throat as he listened to the warden's message. "She's requested to see you." "It's up to you, of course." Brian hesitated, his mind racing. Seeing Eleanor again was the last thing he had expected. The thought of her, her past, their shared history, felt overwhelming. Yet there was something about the letter she had sent, about the journey they had both been on, that stirred something in him. The decision was difficult, but in the end, he agreed. There was a part of him that felt compelled to see her again, to perhaps gain the closure he hadn't even realized he needed. When Brian entered the stark visiting room of the prison, he immediately noticed how different Eleanor appeared. The sharp, defensive edges of her demeanor had softened, and the bitterness that had once clouded her eyes had been replaced by a quiet peace. She looked like someone who had come to terms with the person she was, and with the person she had been. "I didn't think you'd come," Eleanor said quietly, her voice softer than Brian remembered. "I wasn't sure I would," Brian replied, his voice equally as honest as it was unsure. He sat down across from her, the space between them feeling vast despite the physical proximity. "What did you want to say?" Eleanor looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting nervously. After a long pause, she spoke again. "I want to thank you for everything, for exposing the truth, for showing me a side of myself I had buried for so long, and for giving me the chance to let go of the anger I had been holding on to for years. I'm trying to make amends here, in whatever small ways I can." Brian listened in silence, unsure of how to respond. He knew that there were consequences to Eleanor's actions, things that could never be undone or erased, no matter how much time had passed. But at the same time, he recognized the effort she was making, the genuine desire to change, to rebuild, to find some form of redemption. Maybe that was all he could ask for. As Brian left the prison that day, he felt a deeper sense of closure than he had anticipated. Eleanor's journey was her own now, and he had done what he could to help her along the way. It was time for both of them to move forward, to take the lessons of the past and apply them to their futures. Years later, Brian's scholarship fund had blossomed into a full-fledged foundation, offering not just financial aid for education, but also resources for counseling, rehabilitation, and financial recovery. The foundation had become a testament to the power of second chances and the impact of perseverance. A plaque bearing Harold Brooks's name now hung in the larger office space, a symbol of the man who had helped Brian begin his journey toward healing and self-discovery. Standing in that office, Brian looked around at the new group of scholarship recipients who had come for their orientation. He smiled to himself, knowing that their lives would be touched by the same sense of purpose and opportunity that had changed his own. Eleanor's letter, now tucked safely away in a drawer, was no longer a weight on his heart. It was a part of his history, a chapter that had helped shape him into the man he had become. As he watched the new class of recipients gather, Brian realized that life was not about erasing the past, but rather learning from it. It was about taking the lessons it offered and using them to create something better for the future. In doing so, he had found the peace he had once thought unattainable. As the sun set over the city, casting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Brian made his way home. The weight of his own story, and the stories of those whose lives had been impacted by the Harold Brooks Scholarship Fund, was with him. Each one was a testament to resilience, to second chances, and to the enduring power of hope.